Welcome. Happy good noon, I guess we say. My name is James Green. I'm the director of the Brazil Initiative at Brown University, which is an interdisciplinary effort to bring together scholars, students, people from around the world who work on Brazil, who study Brazil, who do research in Brazil, to create a dialogue on campus to learn about what's new in research and events in the country. And we have a very exciting program this semester, the theme of which is equality and social justice, with an amazing array of scholars coming to Brown to talk about this theme as our core theme. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to let you know of two events that are coming up that I want to call your attention to. The first is Chiana Pastel is from Berkeley, will be here Wednesday, October 12th, that is next week at noon, in the McKinney conference room upstairs.
No.
It's changed, the room has changed. It's going to be an Africana...
It's in the Backslash Performance Space in Africana Studies,
Right.
155 Angel Street.
Right, I'm reading from an earlier version of our calendar. Thank you for correcting that, Ramon. So that's a really important event. She's an amazing young scholar doing really interesting work on Afro-Brazilians and Afro-Colombians, and I would really encourage all of you to think about coming and spreading the word on that event. We're really excited that we have her here. Yeah, I see there, location may change, and it did change. It's written there. Okay, good. The title of her talk is The Making and Unmaking of Black Rights in Latin America. And then next weekend, there's a conference on Friday and Saturday entitled Unearthing the South, Indigeneity, Globality, and Community, with a film showing on Friday night and Saturday, an all-day conference with scholars looking at the Global South. I really encourage you to look into that as an event that you might come to. All of this information is on the website of the Brazil Initiative, and if you'd like to receive ongoing notifications of our events, just contact us at brazil@brown.edu. Brazil with a Z, not an S. Okay. The reason I'm mentioning this is because we have an amazing administrative programmer, director, assistant who organizes the events we organize for the Brazil Initiative. Ramon Stern, who deserves a round of applause for everything he does. He really is the backbone of the program, and not only making things happen in a smooth way, but also helping and being a leader in the programming of our events this year, and we're really thankful for him. So with no further ado, I'm very honored to introduce Professor Kwame Dixon, who is Assistant Professor of African American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University. His new book, Afro-Politics and Civil Society in Salvador, da Bahia, examines the transition to democracy, the struggle for racial justice and human rights in Brazil and Salvador da Bahia. His primary research is focused on Brazil and Latin America, concentrating on issues such as Afro-civil society, racialization, that is racial discrimination, and black politics in the Americas. And his latest book, Comparative Perspectives on Afro-Latin America, was published by the University of Florida in 2012. And I had the pleasure of having dinner with him last night to get to know him more and to learn about his research. And he has a wonderful personal trajectory of being an activist in solidarity with the Nicaraguan Revolution in the 70s and the 80s, and then moving through the experience in the 90s. I'm kind of projecting my own trajectory on yours on the 90s. Right, I was doing a little earlier than that, but thank you. And but also describing his first arrival in Nicaragua was on the coast of the Caribbean, and meeting the Afro descendants who are on the coast of Nicaragua, and kind of following the process of the Sandinistas' policies towards the Afro and indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, and then doing work on Esmeraldas in Ecuador and the Afro-Brazilians in that country, and then moving into studies of Colombia, and then finally coming to Brazil, very reluctantly feeling he had the ability to do research there, but eventually doing important work in Salvador Bahia. So we're really honored to have Kwame Dixon with us today, and I'm looking forward to his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. I am very, very honored for this opportunity to come speak. A couple introductory remarks. As Professor Green said, I'm Kwame Dixon from Syracuse University, And I want to thank you, the Brown Initiative, for this invitation. Professor Green, Professor DeGingo, and of course Raymond Stern, who has been amazing in helping to organize this trip. I want to say that this is only the second time ever I've ever presented on Brazil. Because I don't do that a lot. The first time was when my book was published in March. I was a visiting fellow in the Sorbonne in Paris. So I was doing a short-term residency program, and I did a series of lectures or graduate seminars with the students in the Sorbonne. That was the first time, and this will be the second. Okay? And yeah, so that, just so that you know that. Okay? The trajectory, and I really like, you really were listening last night, you really framed that really well. So how did I get to Brazil? So in the 1980s and the 1990s, as a graduate student, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in Nicaragua and during the Sandinista Revolution. And during my time in Nicaragua, I had the opportunity to spend time on the Atlantic coast, or the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, and not only began to understand the experiment that the Sandinista Revolution was enacting with respect to black rights and indigenous rights, but I had the first time in my life to understand the ways in which a revolutionary government was trying to grapple with the issue of race and ethnicity. So Nicaragua sort of began to frame my understanding of what it meant to be black in Latin America and some of the thorny issues that a government might need to address with respect to black rights. So this was in the 1980s, 1990s, and after Nicaragua, I was basically getting ready to write my dissertation, and I was like, well, I have to write this dissertation. So I decided to move to Ecuador, and I lived in Ecuador for 1 year, and I wrote my PhD dissertation on international law and the Ecuadorian government's treatment of its black population. So I wanted to understand what was the Ecuadorian government's commitment to its black population via international law. What was the treatment and what was the discrepancy in the treatment? So that would be 1 year in Ecuador just to do the research, and then another probably year to write it up. While in Ecuador, I would travel to Colombia. And, like the kind of people I would meet in Colombia, I was at a meeting and someone said, oh yeah, we have this new black rights law in Colombia. I was like, really? They said, what is it about? I said, well, there's this new black rights law called La Ley de Negritud, Ley 70, that recognizes black people. I was like, really? So I'm writing a dissertation, I go back to Washington, I finish my dissertation, and I write a Fulbright grant. And I'm funded to go back to Colombia to examine this new black rights law, right? Which has all of these contradictions with respect to what was going on in Colombia. By this time, I'm thinking, okay, well, there's a country called Brazil that I would like to sort of investigate. So I go to Salvador in 1998, 99 for a summer. I returned the following summer, 2000. I go back in 2004. I go back in 2008, and I was like, and this is all Salvador, no way. I'm not that guy. I can't do this. This is too way above me conceptually, politically. I just can't do it. And I brought to you, the Nicaragua, the Ecuador, the Colombia experience. I was like, I just can't do it. It's almost analogous to when they asked Will Smith to play Ali. He turned them down for 5 years. He said, are you crazy? You can't play Ali. I'm not going to play Ali. And I was like, I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to be that guy. So I finally began to think about this. I began to think about Salvador, and I was like, I might be able to do this. So that's how I got to this point of thinking about writing. And also, you have to remember, I grew up in the U.S. South, watching at the end of the 70s the vestiges of Jim Crow segregation crumble. So this is my entrance into thinking about Brazil and thinking about the rights of Afro peoples in the Western Hemisphere. And as Professor Green said, my first book was a comparative volume that examined the status of black populations in the Western Hemisphere. Because my position is that if you don't understand the Bronx, you're not going to understand Bahia. Okay? Therefore, so before we begin, I would like to show a 3-minute video that, in a nutshell, provides a synthesis of the key themes in the book, and then I'm going to stretch it out a little bit, and we can have some discussions.
The city of Salvador, located in the state of Bahia on the northeastern coast of Brazil, is the cradle of Afro-Brazilian culture. The homeland of candomblé and capoeira, Salvador is considered a vibrant center of racial consciousness and political activism. But, despite their unique cultural productions and Afro-referenced identities, the relative strength of Afro-civil society, and an active black political intelligentsia, blacks in Salvador have made only modest political gains, and the majority live in deep, grinding poverty. Afro-Politics and Civil Society in Salvador de Bahia, a new book by Dr. Kwame Dixon, examines the struggle for racial justice. The book examines different forms of black consciousness, assesses the impact of political action and social mobilization, analyzes current debates on social inequality, and contributes to Latin American critical racial theory. The representation of Afro-Brazilians in political structures is extremely low. To date, Salvador has not elected a black mayor nor a black governor. The fact that blacks in a majority black city and black state have to date been unable to gain a modicum of political power confounds many observers. In an effort to understand these issues, Dr. Dixon has analyzed the social construction of political power. He has concluded that in order to address these imbalances, Afro-Civil Society must engage in several important political projects simultaneously. 1. Challenge hierarchies of political exclusion. 2. Construct new forms of citizenship by claiming new rights. 3. Test recently enacted anti-discrimination and affirmative action measures. 4. Reclaim land rights, both rural and urban. And 5. Increase political participation. However, the future is uncertain, and the impact of these measures may cause unintended consequences. As blacks become more entrenched, it will be important to pay close attention to how the new black political elite negotiates power away from the old white ruling hierarchy, the impact of new affirmative action laws, access to higher education, how the new black political elite addresses the harsh administration of justice, as well as the sharp racial inequality in housing, health, education, employment, and the media, and what kind of new economic opportunities and structures will be available, if any. This important new book provides a fresh needed look at black politics in Salvador and Brazil. To learn more, visit www.upf.com.
You've just given all the authors in the room an idea about what
What
the
is-
next book promotion.
Yeah, that's it. They do really good work. They actually do really good work. So there you have it. Actually, in 3 minutes and 4 seconds, in about 1,200 words, you have 85,000 words condensed for the Twitter generation. Okay. So maybe I should just give that to my promotion committee and say, here's the book, right? So let's dig a little deeper here. I ask that you please pay special attention to the concept of Afro-Civil Society. Okay, so I'm introducing that concept in the book, and to my knowledge, it does not exist. So I would like to, over the next couple of years, I would like for that concept to be interrogated so that we can understand what that means. So Afro-Civil Society and the struggle for racial justice in Brazil is the basis of this talk today. The concept of civil society in Latin America forms the conceptual underpinning for understanding democracy, social citizenship, grassroots mobilization, identity constructions, and human rights. Afro-Civil Society, I argue, is a new departure and adds a new layer to how we think about traditional civil society in Latin America, as Afro-Civil Society links issues of racialization, modalities of Black consciousness, the repertoires of various Black identities, Black oppression, grassroots mobilization, and the Black struggle for human rights to the traditional ideas about civil society in Latin America. In doing so, Afro-Civil Society challenges and interrupts the normative underpinnings of traditional civil society, i.e., it is not racially neutral, while at the same time making Afro-Civil Society more conceptually and theoretically relevant to Black peoples and their forms of organization. This is the conceptual premise of my research, and I offer Afro-Civil Society as a new term, as I hope it uncovers new terrain and provides an alternative frame for understanding Black peoples in the Americas and Brazil. So, as we stated, and I'm glad this is a Brazil audience, because a lot of this I can read the audience well, so I see that you have a tremendous amount of information about Brazil and Salvador. And when you're preparing for a lecture, you just never know who's going to show up and how to adjust, right? So I'll make the adjustments as we move through this. So Salvador, as you know, is largely considered a vibrant center of racial consciousness and political activism. And despite the unique cultural productions, Afro-referenced identities, the relative strength of Afro-Civil Society, and an active political intelligentsia, Blacks in Salvador have made only modest political gains. And more disturbing is the fact that, as we stated here, that the majority of Blacks in Salvador live in deep, grinding, hardcore poverty. The fact that Blacks in a majority Black city have been unable to gain a modicum of political power confounds many. Therefore, using the concept of Afro-Civil Society, this lecture will analyze the social construction of political power. It is argued first that Afro groups in Salvador and Brazil are doing the following. First, challenging hierarchies of political exclusion, constructing new forms of citizenship by claiming new rights. Third, testing recently enacted anti-discrimination and affirmative action laws. Fourth, struggling to reclaim lands, both rural and urban. And fifth, seeking to increase political participation and representation on the local, state, and federal level. Theoretically, this research aims to contribute to Latin America critical racial theory and Black social movements. And again, I offer the concept of Afro-Civil Society as the basis. So this research seeks to break new ground by break new ground by examining how Black politics, both cultural and formal, are articulated, and the ways in which the state is responding to various Black demands. But first, before I get to this, I have to say, how did we get to this? There was a whole lot of people who did some amazing research on Brazil many years ago. That is, within the conceptual foundation, there's another foundation that this research is built on. So we have people like Iana Digino, whose early writings laid the conceptual and theoretical basis for understanding Blacks in Brazilian society, and his more recent work, Neither Friends or Enemies. Jane Green's work that fills a major gap in historiography, reminding us how traditional transnational solidarity was was not only key, but also critical in challenging the Brazilian dictatorship. Additionally, Green works retrospectively helps us to understand the reaction to the coup in Chile and the U.S. solidarity movement with respect to the Sandinistas. So if you take his work, you have to go backwards now and say, wow, what happened in Chile? What didn't happen in Chile? What happened in Nicaragua? So my conceptual foundation is really built on some of these other people's works. Also, we have to think about Keisha Khan Perry's work, which analyzes the gendered and racialized spaces in Salvador and the role of Black women as agents of social change. And there's so much more to say about that book, but it's really groundbreaking in the sense of what she does with that community in Gamboa. My colleague at Syracuse University, John Burdick, who reminds us about the role of religion, but not just the traditional religions, but about evangelicals, and reminding us that the evangelicals, the formation of their consciousness, is also central to understanding black politics in Brazil. We can't say, oh, I'm candomblé, but you are therefore I'm black and you are not. And the formation of that consciousness, right? We have to also understand the works of people like Patricia Pino, whose works on the blocos, and what she calls milking Mother Africa. And by that she means how the modern day blocos have commodified blackness, and how the commodification of blackness has perhaps robbed Afro-Brazilians in Salvador perhaps of its emancipatory potential. So we have to really rethink the role of the blocos in the 21st century. And there's so many more works that I could mention, and this is not a job interview. Therefore, I don't have to go through the literature review. Right, I went to one job here, but he didn't talk about that. Like, no, I can't talk about everybody's work today, but those are some of the conceptual basis of the people's work that I'm dealing with, okay? So, therefore, let me walk you through a couple chapters in the book, and we can sort of, in these chapters, sort of snorkel, and then we can return and scuba dive, okay? And as I was thinking of, scuba diving, right? Yeah. So and I was thinking about this, what I will do is, because this would fall flat if I tried to go through all this right now in this setting, but we really need workshops for this. So you sit down and you do a workshop and you say, the rise of black politics, Salvador, right? The role of the blocos, or, the issue of affirmative action specific to Salvador, not in So you will have to do workshops to give people readings, and then we show up and we do this. So I can't do this in this setting because it would just take, I could do it, but it wouldn't work out the way I would like for it to work out. So I will just skim over this and we return to this. So my introduction to the book, and I think this is key, I've tried to provide a brief discussion of the cultural history of Salvador. I try to provide a social landscape of contemporary Salvador, and I review key themes like cultural formations, identity, the rise of cultural politics and formal politics. I think that chapter is crucial. If you don't understand the cultural history of Salvador, everything else falls apart in the book. B, with respect to writing the book, I think that was probably the most difficult chapter to write, and I intentionally wrote it in Salvador, meaning that I didn't want to come back to Syracuse or Spain or wherever. I wrote that chapter, except for, the edits and the changes, in Salvador. So when I woke up in the morning, I'm on the bus, or I'm talking to people, I'm reading the newspaper, I wrote it in the social milieu of the people so that I could much more articulate what I saw that day. So I really wrote that chapter in Salvador to ground myself in the reading to what was going on. I take a brief look at Salvador's relationship to the Portuguese colonial empire. It's a really short chapter, but again, I think that, the key to understanding Salvador is its relationship to the Portuguese empire, which, was the capital until 1763, the specific hierarchy of slavery in Salvador and what that meant. The slave revolt of 1835, led by Muslim slaves, which was one of the most strategic slave revolts and insurrections in the Americas. And the final section deals with the abolition of slavery in 1888 and its consequences. And the reason why this chapter is important is because what I see is that in Salvador, and perhaps in other parts of Brazil, is that the modern day racial classification system of Brazil would essentially grow from the hierarchies of slavery, how blacks were put into those systems. Preto, Negro, Mulatto, Africano, Angolan. Those terms would emerge and form the basis of Brazil's later racial classification system. Of course, in the book I have to deal with the blocos, the Afro-blocos, and of course I had to deal with groups like Iliaye and Olodum, but I really didn't want the book to be about Iliaye and Olodum, But Ilia and Olodum are essential to the cultural history of Salvador in the 1970s and the 1980s. Therefore, I couldn't like say, oh, they know about that and leave it out. So I had to deal with the blocos as the early representations of Afro-reference identities in the ways in which what I call Afro-civil society, that those are the groups I'm referring to, would burst onto the scenes in the 1970s and the 1980s. So I do a chapter on the rise of the blocos and sort of what they're doing now. Of course, I had to deal with the formation of the MNU, Movimiento Negro Unificado, but Salvador specific. Okay, so I'm talking about spending time tracking down the old cadre members of MNU in Salvador, looking at the formation of the MNU in Salvador. Where was it located? Where's your archives? Who were your members? Where's your literature? What was going on? So I wanted to sketch that historical narrative because we hear about the MNU, but we really don't hear a lot about what they were doing in Salvador in the 1980s and the 1990s. So, and also you date the 74 Iliaye, 79 Olodum, and 78 MNU. So you see something happening in Brazil and something is happening in Salvador. So I thought that writing a chapter specifically on MNU, however uneven, would be important to tell the larger historical story of the rise of Afro-civil society. Again, then you have to deal with affirmative action and the controversial, not controversial for me, but the controversial affirmative action laws recently enacted in Brazil. There's a lot of information out there, so I was really tepid about wanting to write about affirmative action because I think most of you probably read about the affirmative action. So what I did was I wrote a general chapter on the affirmative action controversies, looking at the April 2012 Supreme Court decision, the 10-0 ruling, which positively affirmed admission policies at the University of Brasilia and the University of the Rio de Janeiro. So that 10-0 decision is very important. And for those of you who have a chance, you should take a really close look at the opinions of Joaquim Barbosa and actually the whole Supreme Court, what they were saying about affirmative action in Brazil. And as someone said, it was like 10 black activists talking about racial discrimination. When you go back and you can get it on YouTube. So look at that ruling. So I took a look at that. But again, I wanted to go back to Salvador. So what I did is I took a look at the debates in Salvador in the 1980s and the 1990s with respect to affirmative action. And what would be key to this would be understanding the role of groups like Steve Biko. And I couldn't find a whole lot of English information on Steve Biko as an organization. So Steve Biko and other groups would be instrumental in putting issues of affirmative action on the table. So it was not only about discovering what Biko was doing, but I wanted to go, where was it founded? Where was the house? Where was the address? Who were your 10 founding members? Who was your first executive board? What were your debates? How did you set up the classes for the prevestibular? Who were your first 5 students? How did it work? So I went to the procedurals. I'm not a historian either, right? But I had to figure this out. So I was able to talk to a lot of those people are still around also. So I was able to go back to Biko, but when I started doing the work on Biko, I found that pre-Biko, there were students at the Federal University of Bahia who actually had begun to organize classes around the vestibular, around affirmative action, long before the debates began to unfold in other parts of Brazil. So again, what I'm suggesting is that I think this section on Biko and the Steve Biko Institute and the Prevestibular para Negros y Carentes movimiento is absolutely essential because affirmative action is about education. Education is really about democracy and the ways in which black groups put the issue of education on the table. Finally, in terms of the book, it offers a contextual view into the opaque world of Brazilian and Salvadorian politics. Regrettably, unlike the anthropologists and the historians, the political sciences, we really ignored black politics in Latin America. and Afro-Latin American politics in general. So therefore, as a political scientist, I'm always at an extreme disadvantage in Latin America because they, Latin American programs, political science departments, they don't do that. Therefore, they say, what is this? What is this? Like my first person told me, she was like, Afro-Ecuador. She was like, I'm not publishing a book on blacks in Ecuador. That's what I was told. She was like, can you do Brazil? I was like, no. So we don't do black politics in Latin America. Therefore, I thought, as a political scientist, that I had to look at, black politics in Salvador. And I really didn't start off thinking about black politics in Salvador in 1998, 1999, 2000. I just automatically assumed, and that just shows you how research, you can have these invisible micro assumptions operating in your mind, in your consciousness, and not realize that those micro assumptions could lead you to some really poor research or preconceived conclusions. So I automatically assumed Salvador had a black city council. I automatically assumed Salvador had a black mayor. But I was in Salvador in 2013, and Spike Lee was there, and he was on TV that night, and he says, hey, Neto, why doesn't Salvador have a black mayor? I'm like, Salvador doesn't have a black mayor? So I went to the website, I looked at the mayor, I was like, oh my God, I have to take a look at this. So what we have to say is this. I would like to take a couple minutes to walk you through the rise of black politics in Salvador from the 1970s until now. Except I'm not prepared to talk about the 2016 elections. I haven't had a chance to go through that stuff yet, okay? So let's put this. So when Spike Lee said this, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. How would I know if they had a black mayor or a black city council? So I'll go back and do some research. Salvador has had a black mayor, but it has never elected a black mayor. Okay, so that's a little distinction there that we have to think about. So how does this work? First of all, within the tangled complexity of racial hierarchies in the politics of exclusion in Brazil, the city of Salvador illustrates some sharp contradictions stemming from the historical reproduction of white political privilege and the ways in which historical patterns of racialized social inequality have worked to exclude blacks from the political and economic system. The case of electoral politics in Salvador is a case in point. The fact that blacks are close to 80% of the population, but has not been able to gain a modicum of political power is, like I said in the introduction, is really interesting. As, quote, the Rome of the Americas, a center of strong black consciousness movements in a politically active population, many wonder out loud, why haven't the blacks of Salvador or the state of Bahia been able to just move up in the political ranks? In other words, given Salvador's rich cultural formations, which is what I was automatically assuming, right? Why has it not translated directly into the proportional or tangible political and economic capital? Okay, so then again, that was another assumption, that rich cultural formation leads to political power. Okay, no, it does not, right? So, therefore, the Salvadoran blacks have not been able to translate their cultural power to effective political and economic power. So, let's think about this. I would like to talk about that in the 1970s, Evaldo Brito, who is still, unless he recently, he's still alive. In 1979, Mario Evaldo Brito was temporarily appointed by the military dictatorship to serve as the mayor of Salvador from 1978 to 1979. It was an interim appointment. So he served for appointment as someone else came into power. But I would like to talk a little bit about the Brito case as well as Gilberto Gil, both who launched campaigns for municipal office in Salvador in the 1980s. And each case illustrates some of the problems blacks faced as they entered electoral politics during this time. So starting in the 1980s, along with the Blocos, a group of black activists attempted to make an impact on electoral politics in Salvador. working in tandem with the black groups and other ones, they wanted to confront Salvador's all-white political and social elite, which had effectively excluded blacks from local, state, and regional power. So to make a really long story short, what we found is that, first of all, what we have to think about, and we were talking about this earlier, is that in the context of Salvador, people will say, well, all these black, why is it that they can't elect, why can't get on a local city council? What's the problem here? We have to think about this, is that Salvador is composed, this is very important to underscore that black identity and politics in Salvador transverses a broad and diverse class, ideological, gender, religious, and regional spectrum, not to mention the various political parties. It's not like the US where you have two, you may have 7 or 8 political parties. Blacks in Salvador are active in many different political parties that span the most conservative to the most progressive. And you have, different angles of religions, you have rural versus urban people, so it's a matrix of radically different ways of thinking about the texture of black consciousness. So when we think about electoral politics, we have to think about, wow, these are black peoples, but they all come from politics with a different kind of angle. Also, we have to think about this, is that Afro identity intersects and overlaps with other constructs, like we said, ideology, class, gender, religion. And second, we have to think about how those various identity constructions play out in formal politics. And third, how such complex constructions complicate the formation of what is generally or loosely referred to as the black electoral politics, or what some calls the divisions within black people. So these divisions that we refer to are some ways socially constructed, right? So you candomblé, I'm evangelical. You male, I'm female. You live in the rural area, I live in the urban area. The divisions, they're referred to as divisions. But these are natural constructs given the evolution of how blackness evolved in Salvador over the past 50 to 100 years. So in 1985, Evaldo Brito, the gentleman I was referring to, who was appointed the mayor of Salvador in 1979, with the transition to democracy, by the 1980s, Evaldo Brito wanted to run for mayor. Evaldo Brito, Afro, coming from the rural areas, decided to launch his campaign. And this comes directly from Brito. So I had to, have to go interview him, talk to him about this. And the first things in interview, one of those interviews you think, he says, oh, I'll give you 45 minutes, 4 hours. And you have to go back. You have to go back, right? And so my question was to him, what happened in your 1985 political campaign? And he looks at me and says, the gringos would only come here and ask me that because the Brazilians don't care. He said, well, how did you know about this? I was like, well, I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to do my research. So this is what Mr. Brito told me in his office. First, you have to understand who he was running against. He was running against an individual called Mario Kurtz. Mario Kurtz is someone who identified themselves as a Bahian of Jewish identity. Okay? So you have Evaldo Brito, Mario Kurtz, and probably other people running for mayor in Salvador in 1985. And I couldn't track down the other candidates in this. So what Evaldo in the literature suggested is that first, Brito received heavy support from, quote, the black movement. That's not monolithic, please, but I'm just saying for, time frame. He received movements from the support from the black movement, but for some reason in his campaign, this movement was withdrawn, right? Now, his campaign as a result, and he also never received the support of his party, quote, the black movement, unquote, never supported him. And some people claimed that his ties to the military dictatorship was just too close for us. Some claimed that he wasn't black enough, and others claimed he was too black. So Mario Brito, his campaign essentially collapsed. And to this day, as we speak, he is deeply, deeply, deeply disturbed by what happened behind the closed doors of Salvadoran politics. And you know, you only go so far in research, and there's a lot of people I want to ask questions to. I'm just not going down that because it's some deep divisions again. And he's deeply, deeply, deeply upset about it as if it happened yesterday. So his campaign never took off. He was defeated by Mario Kurtz, who received 60% of the vote, to Brito's more or less 33% of the vote. And that would be the modern stage in Salvador of blacks seeking local office, right? 1998, you all know him, Gilberto Gob, also launches a campaign for mayor. Again, to reasons that I don't know, and I do not know, he was asked to withdraw his candidacy by his political party. He was told that it was not the right time, and he was told and instructed to run for city council. So in 1988, Gilberto Gob, right, is asked by the political party, and I have it in the book, the political party he was with. He withdrew his candidacy, however, he was elected to the Salvador City Council, which in 1998 would begin the modern day era of blacks moving up into the local political system. 1992, you would have 4 more blacks elected to Salvador City Council. And by the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, you would see a slow trickle of blacks getting into the local city council and other low-level administrative positions in Salvador. And also at the same time, you would see, in Rio de Janeiro, you may or may not know that São Paulo elected a black mayor in the 1990s. I think it was 1996, I believe. You would see senators being elected. So I'm saying this is a period in which blacks are actually entering the political system and winning to a certain extent. However, in Salvador, that was not the case. What we also find is that also by the 2000s, you would also see where blacks began to serve as vice mayors. So from 2008 until 2010, Mario Brito, who ran for city council, would serve as vice mayor. And from 2012 into 2016, Ivete Sacramento would also serve as vice mayor of city council. In 2012, and that's why we'd have to do workshops on this kind of stuff. In 2012, ACM Neto, at the ripe age of 33 years old, was elected mayor to the 3rd largest city of Brazil. You know the history. His grandfather comes from he comes from a scion of a political family. And Neto has, on an administrative level, on a political level, done exactly what politicians do. Efficient services, clean the parks, been a neoliberal kind of mayor. If I understand it correctly, he was reelected recently with 73% of the vote. Again, I haven't had a chance to go through it, so don't hold me to it. If it was 72.5, I don't know, right? So the question becomes, what explains the inability of Afro peoples in Salvador to rise to the level of just the mayorship? And I haven't looked at governors' races in an attempt to understand this. So I'm arguing that it's obviously the construction of political power, the social construction of political power. Remember, with the transition to democracy, Brazil had been a largely anti-democratic country for almost not a century, but for large swaths of the 20th century. People didn't have that participatory energy. So thus, by the 1980s, when the system was opening up, obviously blacks were still sort of catching up, learning the rules of the game, the intricacies of the political game. And so that might be one reason. Another reason might be is El Salvador, in my view, has never produced what you might call a strong black no, that's not the right word. Let's look at it like this: the intelligentsia, the kind of intelligentsia that you might have, right, in other cities that I don't believe Salvador has been able to produce. And the intelligentsia is related to education, because remember, up until recently, the Universidad Federal de Bahia was mainly all white. So that's some perspectives on how we might want to think about the evolution of construction of political power and the ways in which Afro-Bahians and Afro-Brazilians have attempted to interface with Brazil's political system. I think it's also important to mention that in 2000 also, talking about evangelical consciousness, that one of the most popular, one of the most dynamic, the person who received one of the highest vote totals, because it's a proportional system in Salvador, was a woman from the evangelical movement. And I'm gonna, I stay away from conservative, progressive. I only use if they use it, not what I think. So a woman from the evangelical movement, Tia Enron, would be, and from 2000 until 2012, she would be one of the highest vote getters in Salvador. She's currently, if I understand correct, she's a federal deputy now. However, she has approached politics from an evangelical frame. And her position is that I can approach, she says to me, if I had to interview her, she says, well, Martin Luther King was an evangelical. He was a Protestant. She was like, people never complain about Malcolm X being this. So, well, why can't I be religious? So what I'm getting at is someone who was conservative defined in the Brazilian context. Conservative, did not come from the black movement, would get the highest votes of any politician in Salvador. Going back to Burdick and Selka's view about taking evangelicalism very seriously and understanding the role of religion in politics in Brazil, and not just think, oh, you evangelical, right? You don't get it, right? Yeah, they get it. Okay? And also, again, we have to look at identity constructions and identity platforms with Tia Enron. She says to me, and she's in the book, she says to me, she says, well, literally, this is what she says to me, right? And I have to, I speak Portuguese, but sometimes I have to look and say, what did she say, right? Just to make sure, right? She says, well, I'm not a lesbian. I don't have dreadlocks, right? But why can't I be in the black movement? I'm like, what are you saying? So she's looking at identity construction. So in other words, the construction of Salvador is that, you have to have dreadlocks, you have to be in condom. Like I said, I'm not a lesbian, I don't have dreadlocks, and I don't practice candomblé. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. So she is reconstructing or articulating what most people think it is to be black in Salvador. However, despite her evangelical stance, she's been one of the most popular candidates in modern in modern Salvador, and she is currently a federal deputy, and she might be the first black mayor of Salvador, if she chose to go that route. I could go on and on and on. I think I've provided a frame, perhaps, to open up the discussion around black consciousness, identity platforms, the struggle for electoral politics in Salvador, and I would really like to just open the floor up. And as we do this, think about the concept of Afro-Civil Society. That's the conceptual pillar of this talk. Yes.
And I'm not going to be the first. That would be unfair.
Yes, you would.
So,
What's fair? What's
No,
fair?
and this is just, you're just asking so many wonderful questions and looking at this complexity, as you say, as Don Jobim said, Brazil is not for beginners. It's, it's really true. So I wanted to kind of pose some dilemmas that we think about in terms of politics and people who've been historically marginalized and how that plays out. So, I mean, I think the feminist movement learned that it's not just enough to have a woman in office for
Sure.
things to get better, because you can have a Margaret Thatcher in the office who's a woman, but destroys all the ideas that we like. Or we have Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court who dismantles affirmative action in this country and is an enemy of, I think, most people who are looking for social justice. And so I think the same thing happens in Brazil, especially because of the complexities of social spaces as they, Afro-civil spaces as they emerge, and how people found through evangelical Christianity a means of social network support and internal spiritual support and popularity, popular connections, etc. That you can have things play out in a way that is not, as it has usually been in this country, with kind of the polarity of political parties, and therefore, regardless of how good or bad the Democratic Party is, it became the vehicle by which most progressive Afro-Americans were able to articulate. So I was just thinking, and I need to learn more, because you really stimulated me to do some more research in this area and read your book and understand it, is you know, the Brito, who you mentioned, was in Arena, which was the dictator's party.
Exactly.
And Mario Kurtz was in PMDB, which swept the elections nationwide because it represented a coalition of anti-dictatorship forces. So the question I'm curious about him is, to what extent did the military also, in '72, introduced an idea of affirmative action? They refused to have the category discussed in the election, in the census of '70 of racial categories, because it's argued that they didn't want to show the disparity between with the economic development of the people of European and African descent. So, and I'm looking at, you know, ACM, who is like the most reactionary political party of them, who got reelected, and then, you know, an Afro-Brazilian woman, this woman you mentioned, she might be the new mayor, and she might become a really important creative force for inclusion and equality and as a role model, but she also could be a person who adapts to the horribly reactionary ways in which the evangelical Christians in Congress are implementing policies, even though they have a base of support within Afro-descended communities and people. So I guess the dilemma is, the question I'm kind of posing is what kinds of African identity and connection advance the causes of social inclusion and justice, and what become means to hold back by symbolically being representative, but in fact carrying out an agenda of the Casa Grande, if I may. So that's a question. I don't know if you want to take a few questions or just answer individually, and then...
It's up to you guys. Does anyone have anything similar to that kind of discourse around this? Yeah. Well, okay, so thank you. So let's think about it like this. Right, and that's so clear, and I'm not saying political power is the panacea here. That's not the issue. It's just the construction of political power and the deliberate exclusion of people from the system, right? But what's interesting is that I go through, when I'm in Salvador, I go through sort of like up and down sometimes, like feeling really good, then getting really depressed, right? So I'm thinking is that here you have on hegemonic display this vibrant black culture with zero political power, no economic power. And it's almost as if it's contemporary blackface unfolding in front of our eyes. It's like, okay, well, look at this. Let's go here to contemplate. Let's go, you know. So it's, how do you deal with that? So therefore you get people emerging into political spaces. And, for example, vice mayors have no power. Yvette San Clemente has no power at all, but she's been the vice mayor. So it's almost as if the construction of political power has allowed blacks to emerge within certain kinds of spaces of limited or no power. The white ruling oligarchy is still very powerful, right? And that's in itself problematic. While at the same time, if someone like Tia Enron was to come to the mayor's office or to run for mayor, you know, she comes from a very conservative party. But she received the highest amount of votes across the city, right? So that's what I'm arguing, that we really need to think about, you know, look deeper into Salvadorian politics and look at the historical constructions of power. Because, for example, someone like Silvia Humberto from Steve Biko, also he's from the Socialist Party, basically got the lowest votes and comes out of the black movement. So here's a woman from the evangelical movement, right, who is conservative by their standards, no part of the black movement, swept the votes. And here's somebody, a grassroots activist, who was been a member of Steve Biko, who comes out, who's had an incredibly, you can't question his integrity, is barely, in the last elections of 2012, barely squeaks in. So being black and political and coming from social movements does not guarantee you political power. So it's Salvador, right? I mean, it's Salvador. And then, you know, look at ACM Neto. We have to look at the quality of your opposition, man. He is smooth. He knows what he's doing. And he comes, I mean, imagine 33 years old, which means if you're 33, you're elected, you started thinking about when you were 27 or 24 or something. That's sophistication, right? It's not just having money, but that's really sophistication, understanding how the system works, right? And people, you know, that legacy, like the Kennedys, they love him. I mean, they love the family, right? They love that family in Salvador. So, oh man, he was their father, his grandfather was their So you still have those hegemonic constructions in the minds of people. And that's why that ruling oligarchy must be challenged. I think one of the main areas it was challenged in the area of affirmative action, when you were able to make a clear political argument that the system was unequal, right? That you can't get into the University of Bahia because of, you know, you can't get in because you did poorly on the vestibular. You can't pay for the pre-vestibular, and you went to a shitty public school. Most people get it. You get that argument, right? But to talk about now different kinds of political power, that's a different kind of argument that you have to make, in my view. Right here.
My name is Matt. I'm a senior here in the Portuguese department. And so when I was in Rio, I spent my last fall there. I spent a lot of time talking to students, especially the black professors, and what they thought about the affirmative action, especially as it relates to socioeconomic class, and how you kind of investigated that kind of in between, where it wasn't just a racial-based profile, kind of like the United States, and how they took a class component, as well as what black students were actually benefiting from these policies and which ones weren't.
Okay. So will you just, is it a question or comment?
A question, like how did you go about that process?
Right, okay. So in terms of thinking about what, affirmative action in Salvador?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do was, first of all, I wanted to I wasn't interested in affirmative action as a legal concept. I was interested in how did you put the issue on the table, right? How did that evolve into a issue of serious discussion? Because if you talk to the people who've really studied affirmative action in Brazil, they will tell you that if you had said to Professor Green or D'Angelo in 1994, you know, in 5 years, Brazil is going to have this robust affirmative action, they would have looked at you as if you were crazy, right? So what I was interested in, how did it become a political issue? So the students in the 1980s, in the 1990s, it wasn't even about affirmative action. The black students, it was about, why don't we have evening courses? Why don't we have a better bus schedule to get to school? Why is it the library open after hours, after 5, so that those of us who work can get into the library? So it really began, it's not even about affirmative action, but about questioning the basic, how the institution was set up. A. B, the next question will become, wow, there are no black professors here. There are no courses on black history, African history. So that began to boil up. And then they decided, wow, why are there so few blacks in this university? And they came up with this idea of, why don't we begin to teach ourselves and teach the people behind us how to study for the vestibular. Right, so before we even get to affirmative action as a legal and political reality, we have to see what was going on in Salvador to get the issue on the table. A. B, or C or D, is then you have to say, it is definitely a class question, and the fact that most people in Salvador are black, but they are also poor. And if you look at how the affirmative action is written, it really says 40% of people coming from public schools, which happen to be black. You see? So it doesn't say black people. It says the 40% coming from, because who? No white Brazilian with means puts their children in public schools. Right? So that in and of itself becomes sort of a class question, because most of the people in Salvador go to public schools. Now, with respect to affirmative action in Salvador, I think that maybe it's me, we missed something. Because whatever the formula is, right? Because every state will have a different formula. Every university will have a different formula. Even if you put it at 40%, and that you start that policy tomorrow, it's still going to take another 50 years for blacks to catch up in Salvador, because they're 80% of the population. Right? You've seen Salvador, right? So we have to think about affirmative action in Salvador radically different from the way we think about affirmative action in other areas, because it still will not address the inequalities that's still dormant in Salvador's local social structure. Another thing also that you have to look at, have to think about, is really interesting. It's something about the ruling oligarchy in Salvador that is frightening. And I had a chance to go through some of the old articles around affirmative action. So if it's a race question, class question, I don't know. If it's you have red hair, I don't know. But the ruling in the Ataraji and some of the local newspapers, it was really interesting when they issued the rulings on affirmative action and the discourse around affirmative action, because for the first time, the ruling oligarchy in Salvador said, wow, you guys want to give black people an advantage. So you've been going to the Federal University of Bahia, which is a very good school, for generations. Your kids have been getting into these universities. And the first time a ruling in favor of blacks in Salvador, and you say, oh my God, they're giving black people an advantage. So I think it's those discourses that I think is really important that we begin to think about. And another thing I also think that missed on the map of affirmative action in Salvador is that they were the early pioneers. A lot of people don't recognize it. They look at Rio de Janeiro, but actually Salvador, and it was not the Universidad Federal de Salvador, it was the Bahia State that in the 1990s, under Ivete Sacramento, not the vice mayor, but another Sacramento, who began to implement early affirmative action in Salvador in the 1990s. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm saying I don't think we should look at it as a legal concept, or if it's race or class, but look at it in a broader way to understand how do you redress those decades of educational inequality in Salvador. And I'm saying even with that generous, the most progressive affirmative action policy in the Western Hemisphere, that policy does not address the inequality in Salvador. Yes?
Hi.
And people identify themselves too. Good. You said you studied in Salvador. What was your name?
Matt.
Matt. Okay, but
My name is Edilza. I'm a postdoc here at Africana Studies Department, but the most important information is I'm from Salvador.
Okay, Salvador. Okay.
The right part. But I have some questions.
Sure.
I think I will have two.
Okay.
The first is your views on the progressive political parties on their approach to racial relation issues, not only their black activists, as Gilberto and others, black activists inside the political parties, but how the political parties, the progressive political parties, if you think there is any in Salvador, how they approach the racial relations issues. And I know you said you will not talk about the last Sunday elections, but I don't know if you know that all the mayor candidates declared themselves in the last elections as Afro-descendants.
I saw that, yeah.
Yes, and how your view, what your perspective on that? What this mean when you see Assemineto and other candidates declare themselves as Pardo or Black?
Okay, so yeah, right. Yeah, I read that. Alicia Portugal.
She recounted after.
Oh, she recanted. Okay, flexible blackness, right? Okay, yeah. Okay, so the various political parties in terms of their approach to racial discrimination. Again, I think you have to back that up, right, and begin to think about. And I was speaking to Professor Green last night, and I was said, what do y'all want to do? I'm thinking about this, and in the 1990s, there was a big fight in the Pete in Salvador. Okay, so we're talking about 1992. We're talking about 1996, and again, people with what's this from Salvador? The federal deputy from Salvador. You know what I'm speaking about. The federal.
But also just as a
Yeah.
Evaldo Brito's son is also federal.
Yeah, exactly. And they're in the book too. There's a picture. They have them in the book. So so in the night. So how do you do this?
Luis Alberto.
Luis Alberto. Think so. So in the 1990s, I have to go back to the 90s because we just can't we have to go back to the 90s, right? So there's a real serious debate in the PT in the 1990s about this. Racialization. Why aren't there more black candidates? Why isn't there a black platform? Why isn't there more issues? I'm talking about Salvador now. Now we're talking about Salvador over here, right? And also, so there's this big discussion, and therefore, by the 1990s, the PT begins to think about this issue, began to present more black candidates to office. So there was a robust, and it's here. It's here. It's a robust debate within the PT about issues of race, racialization, and whatnot. And what we can conclude is that black candidates or people who are African descendant, except for certain people, would never talk about issues of race in their campaigns. So the PT is like, well, if black candidates are not talking about race, how can we now talk about race? And as you know, the whole idea of what I call textual submersion, or what Professor here calls, Andy calls the pact of racial silence, hovers over Salvador. Right? So in the early days of the PT, there was this big fight, and I can't speak to the other political parties, and Silvio Humberto is in the Socialist Party. He's not in the PT, he's in the Socialist Party, but Silvio has been very clear about the race question, but his platform for 2012 was education, respect, and derechos. Yeah, linguagem. Right? So, I'm not advising these guys. I can't say you need to talk more about race. So it's something that people are trying to negotiate. And given the broad given the broad identity platforms, does it work? Right? Does it really work when you talk about that issue? You know Theo Inon, right? Right? So not one word. So what am I saying is that there's a structural silence on the whole issue, how that is articulated, right? And people usually back away from it. So therefore, the PT was pushed to think about issues of race in the early 1990s and begin to formulate platforms, and that's when they would support Brito de Silva for the Center Council's office, then the mayor's office, but again, not going into the racialization stuff. So it's complex, and I call it the pact of racial silence, okay? What was your second question?
Mayor candidates.
Well, can I do this? Can I say this? What did you think about that? I mean,
I'm away from Salvador for a while.
no, okay.
The only thing that I think is constitutes a pattern is in the last mayor elections in 2012, all the political parties had a candidate or a vice candidate as black.
That was
so I
exactly.
think black begins to matter in the elections in Salvador, but I don't know what happened in the last year.
And that's really interesting too, because you Neto chose Ivete Sacramento, right? Amazing woman, just spent a lot of time in her office talking to her about this, and was, but that goes back to Netos. He's smooth. He got a woman from the Green Party, a family of 9, came through. She was sort of in the black movement. I don't know if it's a conflict of if she was or not. And that was a brilliant move. On the hegemonic level, it plays into the discourse of what the white ruling oligarchy. We have a black woman that's vice mayor now. The racial democracy theory is reconfirmed, right? So I'm saying that's for me, the blackface at play. In Salvador, when you have these rich cultural traditions and black cultural capital is being used and manipulated like that. And again, 2008 to 2012, Brito. So, I don't know. I'm just, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just, we have to think about some of these things in a way that's common sense and even in some ways a little bit more complex. Question? Yeah, right here.
Yeah, I guess you said something like Salvador never produced a strong black intelligentsia, and I feel like, well, that's definitely then some kind of comparative statement, like not strong compared to places where it's stronger, whether it's in the south of Brazil or here in the United States. But it makes me wonder what you did find about the black intelligentsia that is there, I feel like I only get this like very zoomed in perspective, like I know individuals and it's harder for me at this point to get the bigger picture, but I know people that are, militant and involved, and I just wonder what they would say to that statement, and if you got a sense of what forms of possible collective action are taking place.
Right, and that concept, and actually, I think in the book I say it has produced a weak intelligentsia, right? Okay. But I hear what you're saying. That's not me trying to wiggle out of this or anything. But I think let's say a weak intelligentsia. But what I mean by that, and let me be very careful, or be very clear about that. What I'm suggesting is that given the kinds of limited economic and educational opportunities that forms what we would call the basis of an intelligentsia, right? Being able to not only finish high school, but go to college, being able to own a small restaurant or business, being able to be involved in petty capitalism. I'm saying that process was very problematic in Salvador, and that's where the intelligentsia sometimes arises, excuse me, right? And that's what I'm looking at, the social relations of productions, and how the inability to have the kind of intelligentsia, right? You know, even these people in the book, they will say, is it true you guys have black colleges in the United States? I'm like, yeah, like really? You guys have black professors? So I'm like, yeah, this is 2012 now. I'm like, yeah, you have black deans? Wow. To some people, that's what I'm talking about. Scientists. That level of integration into the political and economic system produces a particular kind of, however, consciousness around issues that are important. And that's just a kernel of one of my ideas that might provide insight into the current status of black politics in Salvador. And that also assumes you think political power is important. Maybe you don't. Maybe people don't think political power is important. Some people don't. Getting at James' question, so what happens there? And that's why I go back to the concept of Afro-civil society. Now, Afro-civil society has been fairly robust, right? And Afro-civil society has been made up of the middle class, right? And that's why I think that to understand this, or at least for me, that the concept of Afro-civil society is important, and we need to think about it as a lens to look at some of these broader issues. See, everyone wants to talk about democracy, but no one wants to talk about civil society, right? The politicians vote for me, democracy. What about civil? No one talks about civil society, right? And therefore, I'm saying there was something unique about civil society in Salvador that produced what we have now.
We have to end at this, I think, and have the opportunity for people informally to talk to you afterward. And
Great.
Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
We really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
your lecture.
Okay.